Have you ever played a heavily story-based game? One that forces you to care about the characters and the conflicts around you? One that tries to put you in the shoes of the protagonist, someone who also cares about these characters and conflicts, someone who's been characterized as a nice and proper person by the people around them. Now, have you ever went against that? Have you ever played a game where you intentionally messed with the conflict, maybe became cold and distant, or even killed a character or two? Has the game ever forced you to do things you wouldn't do simply for the sake of story? That is ludonarrative dissonance. Coined by Clint Hocking, ludonarrative dissonance is a type of game critique described as story versus gameplay, where gameplay tone doesn't match story tone. The problem with a game's narrative is that a player has free will to play the game however they like, if the game lets them. It's human nature to explore, to try new things, but if said things don't have an effect on the story and the game acts like your actions have no meaning, then issues will arise. Such things can bring a player out of the game and sour their experience in return. It's difficult, making a game flow in a way that makes a player feel like their actions in the game matter, more so when said game has multiple options. Creating a story with choices forces the player to interact with the story in a way that most other mediums can't do. Narrative structure and gameplay both benefits and falls short when ludonarrative dissonance is used incorrectly, or not at all. It's the main problem why most story-based games fall flat. You want the player to believe one thing, but do another that goes against said thing, making the story structure come into question. It's what can make or break a game. Unless your intent is to confuse the player. To use ludonarrative dissonance to your advantage is to intentionally pull the player out of the game. Think of the Psycho Mantis fight in Metal Gear Solid, where the enemy reads the player's actions through the first remote slot, something that doesn't typically happen in this game, and throws the player off by making them question what they have to do in person. It's why games that intentionally confuse a player leave a longer lasting impact. Ludonarrative consistency is what you use when ludonarrative dissonance isn't intentional. Think Oxenfree, where glitches and rewinds are used intentionally and placed within the story so that it would make sense narrative-wise and won't make the player question its usage. Consistency is the thing that can fix a dissonant narrative. You have to show a characteristic or idea consistently, and you have to make the player's actions feel like they have weight over the game or story as a whole. You don't often see this criticism brought up with things such as movies, so why is it with games? Because movies have the same issue. Plot and cinematography create dissonance on its own aspect. There are certain movies that film a certain character or plot as though that character or plot isn't as important, despite the story as a whole stating otherwise. This could be either a lack of screen time or lack of usage of both. So why isn't dissonance in cinematography and story debated enough in movies? It's because movies aren't nearly as interactive. Now, that's not to say that this debate shouldn't be talked about, but the viewer does not have the interactability with the movie in its story as they would a game in its story. It's not the same. Ludonarrative dissonance as a critique on a gameplay and story is important, because in order to critique a game fairly, one has to critique every aspect of a game. And creating the idea that gameplay can sometimes make the story feel less by just not fitting in, you create another form of critique, one that conveys the relationship between story and gameplay.